Everyone is really familiar with the same MMOs on every list. Every list, whether it's here on YouTube or it's on your favorite MMO website, the top 10 lists of what MMO to play. The MMOs like World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, Elder Scrolls Online, all the ones that you've seen over and over and over again. So what about the rest of them? What about the not top 10? The MMOs that don't make that list? Well, that's what this video is about. Today, I wanted to bring some attention to some lesser known MMOs that are actually worth trying. And there's two major themes you'll see. Many of these games are either older or are emulators of closed MMOs. There are a couple exceptions though. Let's start with the ones you're all expecting if you have followed this channel at all. Everquest and Everquest 2. I'm putting these two together because neither tends to end up on top 10 lists over the last few years, or perhaps decades even. Everquest, launched in 1999, was once the largest Western MMO, topping out at just about 500,000 or 400,000 players, before World of Warcraft came onto the scene in 2004 and shattered all that shit. Since then, Everquest has grown substantially in content, not in players, but in content. It has shifted and evolved, adding the first progression servers, which are essentially the model for WoW Classic that followed all the way back in 2006, to a point where these servers launch every year, allowing players to try out new rule sets and older content in its heyday. Something that's important given that this is a truly social MMO, or at least it is best played as a social MMO. Going into the game alone is likely going to make you feel, well, lonely. I mean, yeah, that's what you'd feel if you're alone. But as with many MMOs, it's generally less kind to new players than returning players who know the ropes or have connections already. But for a casual player, you can actually still hop in. You can grab a mercenary to join you in your journey through Norath as it continues to expand with 30 and counting expansions. The game is also celebrating 25 years in 2024 and is hosting year-round events, offering in-game loot, and they were recently at PAX East where they did actually confirm that an Everquest 3 is in the ideation phase, and that the game is sitting at around 80,000 to 90,000 players, which is a not insignificant player base. Now, Everquest 2 is the younger sibling of the two games by just a few years. Launching in 2004, Everquest 2 leaned much more into the World of Warcraft style of play with copious amounts of quests, more abilities to use, and updated graphics. At the time, it was cutting-edge graphics, the realistic new age graphics compared to what was WoW's cartoony style. Unfortunately, those graphics haven't actually aged the best. But it still has its fans, even if it's still a bit smaller than the original Everquest is, at least population-wise. It's celebrating 20 years this year and has an equally massive amount of expansions to get through. Everquest 2 will also be launching what they call a TLE, or time-locked expansion server, this year, which will allow you to experience the game content as it unlocks, and in a way that was harkening back to some of the roots of Everquest 2 back in about 2006. Both games offer a free-to-play model but are best played with a subscription. They're PvE first MMOs with little to no PvP to speak of. The former Everquest leans towards a slower pace of combat and more danger, while Everquest 2 is faster but has more updated mechanics in many ways that, if you're familiar with WoW Classic, you'll probably find pretty easy to get into. In both cases, you'll likely encounter issues with population at low levels unless you jump in at the start of a TLE or progression server, but you'll also find huge worlds with deep lore, interesting mechanics, especially later on, a large raid scene at the top end, and devoted fan bases. And both games do offer mercenaries if you're going into the live version, so you can essentially have an automated companion to take along with you to make it sure that you can get the content done. In some ways, trivialize the content. Going from an MMO that was launched in 1999 and very key to my love of the genre, to one that actually launched in this decade, but was inspired by a game even older than Everquest. We're going to talk about Fractured Online. Fractured Online is an open world sandbox MMO that will instantly look familiar to any ARPG player or a fan of older MMOs like Ultima Online, and even to a lesser extent RuneScape due to its top-down style. Where the game sets itself apart is a few key functions in how you play, like learning skills from battling specific enemies, not just gaining skill ups from every enemy. It promises to bring some of the combat from ARPGs like dodging and aiming alongside the combat learning system to create a unique and fun combat experience. When I played Fractured Online, it was still in its earliest development stages and had a lot of work to do, but it showed some promise back then in 2021, and since then, Dynamite Studios has shed their publisher, Game Ago, in the first few months of 2023 and reclaimed the rights to Fractured Online. It has been a story of ups and downs for this MMO, and it currently has a mixed rating on Steam, but they continue to tackle bugs and updates in early access. Many of the negative reviews for the game point to issues with grind, inventory, bugs, and housing system upkeep, while the positive points to a lot of similarities to Albion Online and Ultima Online. Many of the reviews suggest giving the game a shot during a free weekend before purchasing, so I'm going to go ahead and echo that sentiment, just from my own play experience. There is a roughness to it, but as one of the few MMORPGs like this out there, it might be worth taking a look at if you don't want to return to another MMO on this list that we'll get to later. Additionally, as reported by MMOBomb.com, the third race of Fractured Online will be coming on May 8th with the Invasion update. Fractured Online currently features two playable races, the humans and the wild folk, and now they will be adding the demons. The demons will come in two spicy flavors. First, the blood demons, and the second, the Hellfire demons. Originally, demons were planned to have their own world, but as noted by Fractured Online team, that would have taken months to create, as they'd rather focus on building out endgame content and polishing existing content at the time, so demons will start on the human world. And after playing the game for a bit, I think that's a good decision, because they can really focus on really nailing down the loops that they want people to be playing through the game, instead of trying to add in a third way to split up the game. They also talked about their cash shop that will be coming with the update, and with the cash shop, they have promised that there will be absolutely no pay to win, and only showed some cosmetics and dyes. With Dynamite being independent of their previous publishing contract, I'm more likely to believe they'll be able to stick to that promise than I might have been otherwise. This means that the game will have a box price as well as a cash shop, but no subscription. From one newly released indie MMO that was inspired by older ones to another one that was been around for just a little bit longer and actually won our 2023 Scuff Game Awards Indie MMO of the Year, let's talk about Ember's Adrift. Ember's Adrift is a PvE-focused MMORPG that is distinctly low fantasy, but has more magic to the world than you might initially suspect, especially the longer you explore it. But if you're looking for elves and orcs, you're probably going to end up disappointed. Ember's Adrift, built in the Unity engine, has been perhaps the most active post-development MMO I've seen in some time that doesn't actually have a huge team behind them. They are constantly engaging with their community and adding new content to the game, like the recently updated alchemy system that brings in magical enhancements to abilities at level 20 and higher using resources. The game is going to play slower than most modern MMOs. A lot of the things that go into this game are strictly by design. The darkness is dark, the monsters are scary, the danger is dangerous. But thankfully, you'll get a torch for all the times that you get jump scared by a hideous monster or a cute bunny. That happened to me a couple times. It's an MMO built around cooperative PvE gameplay, managing encounters together as a team. But they have recently added several solo-friendly content loops to the game, including solo quest boards and solo loops in their shared dungeons called Ember Veins. It's a smaller MMO in pure size, but you will still get hours upon hours of playtime out of the game if this is your type of MMO, and it does have a satisfying risk versus reward balance. Perhaps best of all though with this game, the MMO has eased up its access points significantly since launch, with a free endless trial that lets you test out the first zone and dungeon. And if you find yourself enjoying the game after those hours and hours of play, well then all you'd need to do is buy the game itself to continue playing beyond what's offered in the trial. The game does have an optional subscription, which will both help support the indie team and continued development for the game, but also offer a couple perks like more character slots. But you'll still get to get a good feeling of how the game plays just by loading up the game and trying it out for a while. But going from that, going to the next one, I'll be honest, this next game, I'm surprised they still have a subscription, in all honesty. but it's also one that is providing a very specific thing for a very specific audience. Mortal Online 2. How do you feel about PvP? What about sandbox PvP in a beautiful world in Unreal Engine 5? Mortal Online 2 released in early 2022 and has since then cultivated a small but dedicated community who play the game for its hardcore, full loop PvP with real-time combat and a classless system. I'll be upfront in saying that the PvP bent of this game has kinda kept me away from it outside of a few spot tests here and there. I'm long removed from my Shadowbane days after all, but if you learn for that with a new coat of paint, with a ton of features that go beyond PvP, like their exciting PvE beast mastery system that includes a wide variety of creatures you can tame as either companions or mounts, home building, or even territorial disputes, well then Mortal Online 2 might be the game for you, especially if perhaps you're waiting for another game that's currently in development for PvP, maybe an Ashes of Creation, for example. Mortal Online 2 is, quite frankly, a game that is it's too harsh for me. I'm scared of that game. But for a significant subset of the population, of the MMO population, this might be the exact game that you are looking for. So that's why I wanted to include it on this list. The hardcore PvP player. So you can like crush the skulls of your enemies beneath your boot, or defend the innocent against the would-be player killer. It's up to you how you want to play this game, because after all, it is a sandbox. You can jump into Mortal Online 2 for $39.99 with 1 month free, followed by a $14.29 a month subscription. For that reason, unless you're really into that PvP part, this might be a bit of a high price point. But if you're looking for that crunchy PvP, and you enjoyed the combat of games like Kingdom Come Deliverance, and you were really actually good at it, you know, like good, like the opposite of me, like all that B-roll, that was just showing how shit I am at this game. But if you're good at that, this might be exactly the game for you. Speaking of games that are an acquired taste and that I will probably get hate about for including, let's go into space. Star Citizen, yes, that game. The one that actually isn't launched yet. But if I'm going to include some other early access titles like Fractured Online on here and the emulators that come later, I'm going to play a bit fast and loose with this list, and what I have experienced of Star Citizen for my $45 backer fee is more than enough to warrant it a spot on this not top 10 list, with potential to rise with some big updates that they've been announcing. Star Citizen, for anyone who somehow missed the ongoing behemoth Kickstarter MMO that has been in development since 2012 in conjunction with their single-player title Squadron 42, is a massive space MMO that recently is trying to expand their server sizes as well as updating character creation. When I played Star Citizen in 2023, I was initially highly critical of two main things. The gameplay loop of missions felt rudimentary and Star Wars Galaxies-esque, and for all the things that Star Wars Galaxies did well, the mission system was simply not it. It was like questing, but worse, just like blander. But it sounds like in the upcoming Alpha 3.23 in Star Citizen, that is actually going to be changed significantly as they add a lot of flavor to it. The other part that I was struggling with was the server size. 100 players per server felt awful. But enter server meshing, which recently tested up to 350 players. So this game is actively working on the things that I found difficult with it. But what about the things that I thought would have warranted a place in this list even if they weren't fixing those things? Where this game has really shined for me and why it's on this list without needing to look forward to the future of 1.0, which has been mentioned in a recent letter from Roberts Industries, is the space flight and the near orbit flight. Spaceflight in Star Citizen is unbridled fun, especially when flying on or around a planet. And I say this as someone who is admittedly very bad at any sort of flight in games that with or without flight sticks. It's just fun, it's responsive. I have at times said that if Starfield had the same kind of space combat that Star Citizen has, it would have done so much better because damn, it's so good. It's just fun. Star Citizen can be dinged for many things, and $600 million and 12 years of development later, it still feels depressingly far from completion. But if you can stomach playing an in-development title, Star Citizen offers some of the most incredible small things in an MMO I've ever seen, like how they've integrated much of the HUD into the game itself, as well as of course the flight. But there's so much more to it, the different planets that you'll get to go to, all the different things all the different outfits and things that you'll be able to add. This game has a lot more to it right now in its current state than I think a lot of people think. Now, of course, there are some issues with the fact that yes, it is recently selling a package that costs more than my salary, but there's also the part of this with this game, like, you know, the same argument that's made for Dragon's Dogma 2. Everything can be earned in game and honestly pretty quick and easy. And I think that's even more the case with Star Citizen than a lot of other games that say, yes, you can earn it in game, because you really can. And no, that doesn't mean that this is a good thing. In fact, it is a bad thing and a knock on the game as far as I'm concerned. But at least in this case, it does feel like this is one of those rare instances where you really can earn things in game. So please don't buy their spaceships. If you play this game, don't buy their damn spaceships. Just play it. Just play the game. It also exists as one of the few big budget sci-fi MMOs out there, along with others that are getting long in the tooth, like EVE Online, Star Trek Online, Star Wars: The Old Republic, and our next option, which is actually an emulator. Star Wars Galaxies. Now, I've made the conscious choice here to exclude any specific emulator server for Star Wars Galaxies because there are several of them, and they will appeal to different tastes. Star Wars Galaxies was an MMO in many ways before its time when it released in 2003. It brought in a lot of new sandbox ideas to an MMO genre that had only a few giants, with the largest of them, Everquest, providing a straightforward group and grind gameplay loop. By contrast, Star Wars Galaxies added in-depth in-world housing, crafting with full-on farms for harvesting resources, planet hopping, PvP and PvE, animal taming, non-combat progression, and skill trees that you could use to build your character from the ground up in different ways. In many ways, it took a lot of Ultima Online sandbox and iterated on it until it became its own unique game that has been mentioned as inspiration for many games coming in the future. Expertly outlined in an article from Bree Royce over at Massively titled, "Stop Name Dropping Star Wars Galaxies and Make a Spiritual Successor," which I'll link below, because stop name dropping Star Wars Galaxies as a damn spiritual successor and make a game, make another one. But until then, we have emulators. Rich Vogel, who worked on Star Wars Galaxies, compared it to a version of No Man's Sky in 2003. Star Wars Galaxies was beloved by many, allowing players to jump into an IP they already loved and play the game in a way they wish to. A game which, on the heels of the prequel trilogy, didn't actually even start with Jedi, obfuscating them behind a complex and difficult quest that took ages, then opening them up to all players later in the game's tenure, along with massive changes to the game that would rework combat and leveling to make it feel distinctly more like the other contemporaries of the time period, before eventually closing to make way for another Star Wars MMO as the license expired, Star Wars: The Old Republic. Thus enter the emulators, which offer everything from custom content to pre-NGE and post-NGE servers, servers with Jedi and servers with none. Star Wars Galaxy's emulator community is perhaps second only to Ultima Online in the passion and dedication of various communities to bring forth different versions of the same MMO. To help you decide which version, the more sandbox craft your own MMO or the more familiar WoW style MMO, I've included a link down below to the website that will help define the servers for you. But the next game on our list is yet another emulator of a shuttered MMO that may have closed a little too soon. Well, you don't actually need a list for it because there's only one of them, but it's surprisingly successful. Warhammer Online. Warhammer Online was going to be the MMO that killed WoW. Well, like Age of Conan was going to kill WoW, and Rift was going to kill WoW, and 100 other would-be WoW slayers. Well, they all failed because that happened. But Warhammer Online ended up failing harder than those others as it launched quickly and stumbled out of the gate and just fell flat on its face. Warhammer was the basis of Warcraft long before World of Warcraft was a thing. But the attempt to turn that emulation around and harness Warhammer's extensive lore into an MMORPG format that paid homage to its great predecessor, Dark Age of Camelot, with their realm versus realm versus realm success, well, it failed miserably in Warhammer Online's short-lived experience. And save for some quick thinking, that would have been it. Warhammer Online could have ended. But enter Return of Reckoning, a full-fledged emulator project of Warhammer Online. It is easy to set up and actually feels, in many ways, better than the original, though perhaps at least some of that is pure nostalgia. Return of Reckoning provides everyone with the dark, gritty world you'd expect from Warhammer, expansive class rosters for order and chaos, players with their unique playstyles like the Exploding Bright Wizard or the melee healing Disciple of Cain. And yes, to reiterate, the Bright Wizard can damage themselves by building up too much combustion and blowing themselves up. Warhammer Online at launch was largely a game focused on PvP with realm versus realm lakes where you can engage in PvP in the open world or in sieging flag spots, as well as structured PvP, much like Warcraft's Battleground. It should be noted though that doesn't mean the world is open PvP. This is not Mortal Online 2. There are areas of the world that are open PvP and there are benefits to engage in it. But there are also areas of the world that are purely PvE focused. One of the lesser known innovations that Warhammer brought to the MMO space was the public quest. Public quests are essentially PvE events that go through stages and you are just grouped with the players nearby to complete them by proximity. Essentially the same thing that were later used in games as varied as Final Fantasy XIV, Everquest 2, World of Warcraft, Guild Wars 2, Elder Scrolls Online. Really, the list goes on to varying degrees. The anti-social questing and grouping system actually worked quite well, but like many things, it relied on players to be present or else it sort of broke down. That's where Return of Reckoning has found a loophole that wasn't present in the original Warhammer game. Fast travel. They've integrated a new system that would leverage their smaller population and allow players to go straight to the action by using their knowledge tome. This allows for things to be done together as a group by focusing on where players are at the current time. It is not perfect, and of course certain things like at lower levels are going to be more difficult than things at higher levels, just by the nature of the way the game works. But it is at least something that works a bit better than if it was just like purely what it had been before. Because you know where the action actually is, especially for PvP. PvP, it really helps out. It's an MMO that does feel dated at times, but it still is a great deal of fun to play, and I recommend giving it a shot if you lean towards PvP, but want a bit more structured and less threatening PvP than Mortal Online 2, while also wanting a satisfying lore, story, fantastic class fantasy, and dynamics, as well as solid PvE with interesting lands to explore and conquer. Now, I mentioned with Fracture Online that there was one game you could return to, And I felt like I have to include this one because Ultima Online is huge for me personally as my first MMO, but it's also still going. It also has one of the largest and most thriving emulator communities. Our last emulator on the list is harking back to the very first MMOs, but I want to include not just the emulators for Ultima Online, but also the live server, especially given some recent developments. We'll start with the live version. Ultima Online is a sandbox MMO that released in 1997, is an MMORPG royalty, and while not the first MMO, it was one of the first to be largely successful and has served as an inspiration for many games over the years. Ultima Online originally came out as a hardcore PvP MMO with full loot that was later split into two lands, a PvE land and a PvP land, giving players the option to experience the game either way. This was a boon to many players and a curse to others who liked the player killer system, which would turn players into murderers. The live game now, though, is decidedly more friendly to PvE, and despite its age, PvE is thrilling and scary in Ultima Online. The game relies on trial and error or pre-existing knowledge to see if things will murder you, or if you'll be able to handle them. There is no level system, so there's no direct correlation. Instead, you pick from a host of skills to make your character, mastering up to 7 of them for a total skill cap of 700. This, combined with your gear and skill, determines whether or not the dragon will eat you for lunch, or you'll tame it and parade it around the town after a quick stop at your player home. Yes, this game has animal taming, player homes in the world, PvE dungeons, an extensive crafting system, world bosses, PvP, and massive continents to explore. It's an MMO you can easily lose hours upon hours to, but it is also very dated, requiring a great deal of setup with macros and dated systems. It will take you some time to get used to it if you're coming in from more recent games, but once you get into it, it'll slowly become intuitive. I mentioned the live version first because recently we got word that the new version of Ultima Online is entering beta testing called New Legacy, with plans to launch it in fall of 2024, a mere 27 years since the MMO first launched. New Legacy is a new server rule set aimed at tweaking and simplifying the game's starting experience, focusing on a core RPG experience. But there are other versions of the venerable MMO out there if you don't want to wait. Emulators. These have existed for ages, and some of them have used the core of Ultima Online to become something new. Like Ultima Online Outlands, which has its own custom quality of life tools, custom NPCs, and custom creatures to fight. Skill reworks an entirely custom world that brings back the open world PvP of the original Ultima Online before it changed. There are many Ultima Online emulators out there appealing to many different playstyles, some with accelerated gains to speed up your time, PvP focus, PvE focus, or custom servers like Outland. If the game appeals to you, they're worth checking out. So now there's a couple more MMOs that I could have put in this final spot, and there's like games like Final Fantasy XI or City of Heroes with their private server and how it has now been officially recognized, and giving it some like permanence in a world of a lot of impermanence when it comes to emulators. Both of these MMOs are worth playing. Final Fantasy XI as an older hardcore PvE MMO, and Sea of Heroes as its own unique thing in its own genre. Its only real competition right now might be DCUO. But I wanted to put an MMO here that doesn't get mentioned much at all. An MMO that has its own dedicated fan base and is served as a baseline for some of the MMOs that do make it into the top 10, like Neverwinter. This MMO is Dungeons & Dragons Online. DDO released in 2006 and can currently be played for free, though like just about every older MMO that's now free, it has an optional subscription with some important perks, like more of the game being available to you, faster experience gains, more characters, storage, even movement. If you're coming to DDO from your weekly D&D campaign, you might also be in a bit for a shock, as this game runs on D&D 3.5. using Dungeons & Dragons itself as a basis for the game, something that will become very apparent as soon as you start playing. It holds a special place in the MMO genre largely due to so many games using D&D, at least for inspiration. From Everquest to the next big MMO, D&D has been a consistent source to draw from, and DDO uses it not just as a setting, but playstyle. DDO features dungeon runs with traps and encounters, even DM narrators to get you into an immersive experience of the dungeons.
A magical barrier blocks the way, and behind it, another Sahuagin performs unholy rituals at a devourer altar. This barrier appears linked to 3 sockets in the wall. If you find the crests to those sockets, it may allow you passage.
To me, this MMO is mostly for the fans of Dungeons & Dragons, its iconic characters and NPCs, and its locations. It is an ode to it, and while at times the combat and graphics can feel dated, and honestly, when I played, it felt a little bit way too easy, though they do have different difficulty settings that you can unlock, so there's that. But things like that could honestly be said about a lot of the games on this list, too, like dated and older. There's a reason why this is the not top 10 list and not the top 10 list. But like Ember's Adrift with their free trial, or the Emulator MMOs that don't have any requirements to access them, or EverQuest and EverQuest 2, this game has a lack of a barrier to entry. You can jump in and try it. You can actually just download it on Steam. That's what I did. Although of course it just kind of like launches its own launcher separately from Steam, but it is at least an easy process to get into the game and then start like feeling your way around in it and see if you enjoy the kind of the very unique style of DDO. I enjoyed just running around a bit and doing some of the dungeons, and you get to kind of like experience a dungeon run in that specific way. And while the game used to be very focused on a group oriented gameplay, they have since shifted that, and you can have like AI companions with you in dungeons. So it is a lot more friendly to the solo player than it used to be. So if you played it before and you remember, like I did, how difficult it was to play, because I remember jumping in like 2006 and not being able to do anything. Well, now you can. Of the games on this list, DDO may be the one that gets the least love, the least attention. So that's why I wanted to include it. Just, you know, maybe you can give it a try if you want, if you're looking for something a little bit different. And keep in mind, and this is something that I think that is worth mentioning, you don't have to spend the next 5 years in these MMOs. You can enjoy them for a couple months, cycle through them, come back, try again. I think we are past the point where we'll have just a single MMORPG. I think we all still want to find that one MMO that can so dominate our attention as to be the only MMO we play. But I think that we're much more in a place now where MMOs are a bit more ephemeral. But there it is, your not top 10 list, your not top 10 list of MMORPGs. What game did I miss? What game would you have liked to see on this? And keep in mind, it has to be a game that would not have been in a top 10. So like, no, it can't be RuneScape or Lord of the Rings Online or any of the games that you're normally going to see on those lists. But what game do you think should have been on this list? I would love to know, because it doesn't just help me, but also maybe the other people watching who may be looking for some game to try. Maybe you are a huge fan of Rift. Maybe you think that Runes of Magic is a great game. Let us know down in the comment section below, what is your not top 10 MMO? My name is Edward Flynn. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.